Dostoevsky pursued the idea of nihilism even farther, because Dostoevsky was certainly someone who was willing to go to the ends of an argument. And one of the things he proclaimed was that if there was no God, then anything was permitted. And his basic hypothesis was, well, if there's no ultimate arbiter of values, if there's no transcendent arbiter of values, then you're radically free. Now, the existentialists would say, well, you could use that radical freedom to find meaning in your life. But one of the things Dostoevsky realized was that you could use that radical freedom for anything that you wanted. And so in his book, Crime and Punishment, for example, he explores the actions and beliefs of a student named Raskolnikov. And Raskolnikov is a starving student. He's a law student, and he doesn't have enough to eat. So, of course, his cognition is a little bit on the addled side because he's going through periods of starvation and drunkenness. So it's not like he's thinking that clearly. He wants to become a law student so that he can help society. And he finds out that his sister is basically willing to enter into a loveless marriage and more or less prostitute herself so that she can generate enough money to share with her mother so that they can fund his continuation through law school. And he thinks that wouldn't be a very good deal. At the same time, he's indebted to a pawnbroker who everyone hates, who's an absolutely miserable person in every possible way. And Dostoevsky sets up the situation like that. So the pawnbroker has a niece, if I remember correctly, who she basically enslaves and mistreats, and she squirrels away all sorts of money but never does anything with it, lives in absolute poverty. And anyways, he considers her the sort of person without whom the world would be a better place. So having all of these things co-occurring in his imagination, he decides that because there are no ultimate arbiters of value, that all morality is essentially cowardice, which is kind of the reverse of what Nietzsche concluded. As he said, most people were cowardly and justified that with their morality, but Raskolnikov took the other idea, which is, well, why do I have to obey any rules at all? If there's no ultimate source for any of these rules, it's just convention and cowardice. And if I have enough strength, then I can leap outside of that framework and I can do whatever I want. So he decides to kill the pawnbroker, which he does, and quite successfully. And not only that, he gets away with it. And that's about the first third of Crime and Punishment. And the rest of the book is the discussion of the manner in which he comes unglued as a consequence of having performed this act. And it's an absolutely brilliant study of the way that value system holds you together, even in ways that you don't know. And then if you step outside of that and violate your relationship to it in some really intense way, then there's going to be catastrophic psychological consequences that'll echo through your whole being. We know that this is more than theory, because many people, soldiers in particular, who develop post-traumatic stress disorder, when they observe themselves doing something that they regard as tremendously cruel or vicious or immoral. And they're in the situation where, acting in that manner is highly probable. It's a war situation. It's usually very intense, and they don't have a lot of time to make decisions, and God only knows what the specifics are of the particular event. But many people come to be so shattered by observing themselves do things they can't believe that a human being would be capable of doing, that they never recover. And it's partly because they violate the ethical structure that holds them together, holds all their ideas and their plans and their perceptions and their interactions with other people. That's a unified field in some sense. And if you violate it and it fragments, then you're left absolutely fragmented. And that's not even a psychological observation. It's a psychophysiological observation. You can stress yourself so badly, raise your stress level so high that your brain starts to become damaged by the stress hormones. And so it's not just a psychological state. It's damage to the core of your being in some sense. Now, the collapse of these belief systems and their destabilization was well thought through by these thinkers by the end of the 19th century. And then we have the technological transformations and the the sociological and political transformations of the early part of the 20th century that leaves everyone in a state of confusion in some sense. Like in Germany in the 1920s, of course, the Germans had gone through this terrible period of trench warfare. So all their men were brutalized. Some of them had been on the front for months, and that was in the trenches. And then, their political system had collapsed, and they'd put a weakly rooted democracy in place. And then the economic system collapsed, and Germany went through a period of hyperinflation. So that money, the value of their money, basically dropped to zero. And so that meant that if you were 65 years old and had saved up your whole life to have enough money to retire, and were a good citizen, and prudent and careful, every single thing you ever owned disappeared. And so at the same time, the communist revolution had taken place in Soviet Russia, and there was great concern within Germany that the same thing was likely to happen there. And certainly the communists were always pushing for that, because they had the Comintern, which is the international communist movement, which was devoted towards destabilizing, non-communist governments and producing the preconditions for the revolution. So it wasn't like it was just paranoia, it was a real threat. And it was out of all that mess that came the emergence of the fascists and the Nazis. And it's not that, it's not that surprising, because chaos breeds the desire for order. And so that was one direction that people could go, instead of following an abstract Messiah, let's say, the sort of idea that was embedded in classical Christianity. They realized a new Messiah, and that was Hitler. And that certainly didn't seem to be any improvement, because Hitler was really a Messiah of destruction and fire. And, the World War II killed about 120 million people, and of course it left Germany in absolute ruins. And Hitler killed himself in his bunker underneath Berlin while it was burning, and the Russians were advancing into into Germany, and they were not happy. You didn't want to be a German national while the Soviets were advancing towards you after your country had invaded theirs, and pushed them back halfway across the Soviet Union, and produced a tremendous amount of damage and distress. It was an awful situation, and the messiahs that the Russians turned to, Lenin and Stalin, were barbaric and brutal beyond comprehension, and it's a strange thing. We're not very well educated in what happened in the Soviet Union in the 20th century. We know far more about what happened in Germany, say with the Holocaust, and it's very important that people should know about that. But there were tens of millions of people brutally destroyed in the Soviet Union, and partly because they were murdered by people who were, at least in principle, motivated by left-wing utopian visions. Our education system seems to regard that as somehow more forgivable, which it certainly isn't. So, the whole generate secular alternatives to religious belief issue didn't seem to work out very well. And then the nihilism alternative, well, that has its own problems. One problem is the sort that Dostoevsky talked about, and you see the kids who go up and shoot up high schools and explode in rage. They're often people who feel that they have no meaning in their life, that life itself is contemptible, and that suffering is too extreme, and that they bear the brunt of unfair reality, and they develop unbelievably dark and destructive theories of revenge and mayhem sometimes over the period of years, and then they go out in the world and lay those things out. And it's not like their thinking is irrational. It's coherent. It's just predicated on principles that you might not agree with, such as, the principle that everyone that I don't like deserves to die. But, in the absence of a really formal way of demonstrating that such thoughts are not only immoral but wrong, in some absolute sense, it's very difficult to come up with ways of defending ourselves against those two extremes, the extremes of destructive nihilism and the extremes of ideological possession. Now, Nietzsche started to work out some solutions to this, and I just started to touch on those at the end of the last lecture. Dostoevsky's solution was a return to Christianity, fundamentally, and its revivification, and that was the same tack that Alexander Solzhenitsyn attempted to lay out, and also Tolstoy in Russia, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit more in the next lecture. Nietzsche's idea was that people would have to, he said, in his quote about the death of God, that people would have to become like gods just to be able to tolerate the consequences of this dismemberment of the previous civilization. And he believed, well, his thinking on this, I would say, is somewhat fragmentary. I mean, Nietzsche was a great critic of Christianity, institutionalized Christianity, and a great diagnostician. He could say what was rotten at the core of Western civilization, we'll say modern civilization. But when it came to actually describing what to do about it, well, he didn't live that long. He died a fairly young man. There's actually a video of Nietzsche in the mental hospital online. I just found it the other night. I had no idea that he was ever captured on video, but there's video from movie from about 1899 showing him in the mental hospital where he ended up in his early 40s. So he talked about the development of the being he called the Overman, which is often translated as Superman, and his idea was that people would have to take onto themselves the burden of creating new systems of meaning and new moralities that were suited to them, that they would have to create new values. Now, Jung took Nietzsche's diagnosis very, very seriously, and you can certainly say that Jung was as much influenced by Nietzsche as he was by Freud, and I would say in some ways he was influenced more, because one of the things that Jung was trying to do was to identify where the lost values had gone. So the Nietzschean idea is that it's possible for human beings to create their own values. Now, there's a problem with that, or there's a variety of problems with that. And one is that it doesn't seem exactly true in that, and a lot of the existentialists who followed Nietzsche, like Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, believed in the radical freedom of human beings, that we were doomed to be free, in a sense, and that it was absolutely necessary for us to conjure up our own meanings and values, because fundamentally we faced the void, and life was nasty, brutish, and short, to use Hobbes' terms, and that we had to be able to confront that and live despite it. And, well, there's a variety of problems with that solution. The first one is, well, if you come up with your system of values, there's no reason, and I come up with mine, there's no reason to assume that they're going to be sufficiently integratable so that we don't have to fight each other to the death. That's a big problem. So, you'd have every single person with their own system of beliefs. Well, fine, except how do, that in a sense, that's a structured kind of philosophical anarchy. Well, okay, maybe that's good if you happen to live alone on an island, but if you're stuck with all these other people, then that becomes a very difficult thing to manage. And I think it's partly for that reason that Sartre famously said, hell is other people. Because he thought of the other, in some sense, that which was not him, as an oppressive force that stopped him from manifesting his destiny in the way that would have been best for him. Well, hell might be other people, but that doesn't mean that, first of all, that's a very one-sided way of looking at things, because of course hell is other people. Hell is you too, and hell is nature. There's lots of places you can find hell, but by the same token, the most meaningful elements of people's lives are often their social relationships, and you can't lay everything at the door of pathological society. And we shouldn't forget as well that Sartre didn't, come up with any reasonable critique of the communists until the late 1960s. And that was a little late. People with any sense, like George Orwell, had figured out that the whole Soviet experiment had become radically murderous by the early 1940s. And so Sartre, proposed radical freedom as the existential response to the unveiling of no meaning, but when it came right down to it, he couldn't resist identification with a totalitarian structure. So I don't see any reason why we should really pay any attention to what he had to say. So, now there's another problem with the idea that people should create their own values, and that is that it's not so simple. You know, and the problem seems to be is that you don't obey yourself very well. You know, you can say, well, here's my code, I'm going to live by it. So, and let's do that simply to begin with. You say, well, I'm going to study very hard and do well at my classes, just for the sake of argument, you know. But you don't. You know, you procrastinate, and you have a paper you're supposed to read, and you know you're supposed to read it, and you need to read it for reasons that are even hypothetically important to you, but there's no damn way you can get yourself to sit down and read it. Your attention wanders, and you go to do 3 or 4 stupid things, and you feel terrible about it, like you feel like you're betraying yourself, and maybe this is a continual pattern in your life, but one of the things you find out is that you don't get to create your own damn values, because for some reason you're not in charge of yourself. And of course, that's where the psychoanalytic ideas start to come from. You know, Freud notices, this is in the aftermath of Nietzsche, that you're not the master of your own psyche. You know, that there's many sub-yous inside of you, and they don't all want the same thing. And so the idea that you can generate your own meaning is it's an insufficiently developed idea, because there's a lot of meaning-making generators residing within you. And not only do they not all point in the same direction, which is a huge problem, but they don't necessarily lay themselves out in some integrated fashion across time, and they don't necessarily operate together in a way that's going to enable you to find your place with other people and in society. So, you know, make your own meaning. Well, which part of you? You know, you're not a unified thing, so that's a big problem. And then, well, these other problems just remain unaddressed completely. Well, one answer to that, and this is the answer that the more radical existentialists took, is, well, society has to be reconfigured. But, you know, we kind of know where that leads to. When people are doing radical societal reconfiguration, at least as far as we've been able to tell, most of the time that's an absolute murderous catastrophe. So, you know, it seems reasonable to me to presume that those experiments have already been run.